A 20-year-old girl, passionate about horseback riding, rode her bicycle to the stable to visit her favorite horse. She left home after noon but never reached her destination. She was found barely alive in a wooded area with multiple injuries. The police were perplexed as there were no clues at the scene indicating a criminal or the circumstances that led to the tragedy. The case stalled but resurfaced several decades later when a small overlooked detail from previous investigations became the key to solving the mystery. Jody Loomis was born in 1944 in the cozy suburb of Seattle named Mill Creek. This area, surrounded by picturesque forests and green fields, became her native place where she spent her childhood. Mill Creek, with its quiet streets and friendly neighbors, provided ideal conditions for a happy childhood. In school, Jody was known as a kind and responsive girl. She made friends easily and was always ready to help. Her classmates and teachers valued her for her sincerity and kindness. Jody actively participated in school events and sports competitions where she demonstrated her talents and energy. Moreover, Jody loved nature. She often walked around her hometown, enjoying the beauty of the forests and fields. These walks became a source of inspiration and tranquility for her. From an early age, Jody showed an extraordinary love for animals, especially horses. Her parents noticed this passion and supported it by arranging frequent visits to local farms and stables. Little Jody spent time among these majestic animals, watching their grace and strength with awe. When she turned 7, her parents enrolled her in a riding school. Jody enthusiastically learned to ride, developed animal care skills, and gradually mastered the nuances of horseback riding. Her attachment to horses grew over the years, and this hobby became an integral part of her life. Jody became an active participant in local competitions and shows, where she often won prizes. She spent a lot of time at the stable, where she found many like-minded people. Among these people, she met Jim, a young man who was also passionate about equestrian sports. Their friendship soon turned into a romantic relationship. Jim was not only Jody's sports partner but also a reliable support in her life. Their relationship developed harmoniously and with understanding. Jim and Jody often spent time together participating in competitions and training, as well as arranging romantic rides through the scenic surroundings of Mill Creek. They shared dreams and plans for the future, dreaming of creating their small stable and continuing their passion. Jim was a charming and kind young man with whom Jody felt truly happy. Their relationship developed rapidly, and soon Jim proposed to Jody. This moment became one of the most unforgettable in her life. He chose a special place for this and your favorite secluded spot in the woods, where they often spent time together, enjoying nature and each other's company. From that moment, preparations for the wedding began, which was to be a grand event. While waiting for this day, they lived in Jody's parents' house, where a warm and friendly atmosphere always reigned. Her parents were happy to accept Jim into their family and treated him like a son. In her parents' house, the young couple felt cozy and comfortable. Together they planned their future, dreaming of their own home, where they could start a family and continue their hobbies. They often spent weekends at the stable where Jody trained and Jim helped her take care of the horses. This time strengthened their relationship and made them even more united. On August 23rd of that year, Jody decided to visit the horses at the stable. Usually her father drove her there, but that day he was busy with urgent matters. Not wanting to miss a visit to her favorites, the girl decided to go there by bicycle. She left the house after noon when the sun was high in the sky, promising a warm and clear day. Although Jody was already an adult and independent, her mother always worried about her. This time, seeing her daughter off, she could not hide her anxiety and asked Jody to return before dark. As a farewell, she gave her some change so that Jody could call home from a payphone if necessary. Hours passed, and with each minute, the parents' anxiety grew. At first, they tried to calm themselves, thinking that the girl was just delayed at the stable, enjoying the company of the horses. However, as it got dark, their anxiety intensified. They expected Jody to call and report her whereabouts, but the phone did not ring. Closer to night, their anxiety turned into panic. Jody's father began calling friends and acquaintances, asking if they had seen her. Her mother constantly looked out the window, hoping to see her daughter's familiar silhouette on the bicycle. But Jody was not there. With each moment, their fear for their daughter became increasingly unbearable. The parents did not know what to do or where to turn. The most terrible scenarios spun in their heads, and their hearts stopped at every minute of waiting. Time dragged on painfully long, and the parents realized that something had gone wrong. Deciding not to waste a minute, they turned to the police, hoping for help and a quick resolution of this terrible uncertainty. This night became the longest and most agonizing in their lives. The weight, anxiety, and feeling of helplessness merged into one, causing them to pray for their daughter's well-being and her prompt return. Late at night, the police knocked on Jody's house to deliver shocking news. The parents, who had not slept all night, immediately understood that something terrible had happened. The father opened the door, and two officers stood on the threshold with grim faces. One of them began to speak, stating that Jody had been found on the street barely alive but unfortunately had died on the way to the hospital. The words of the police officer struck the family like a thunderbolt. Jody's mother, unable to bear what she heard, fell to the floor in despair, her heart tearing apart from pain. The father stood motionless, unable to utter a word, overwhelmed by deep shock. The world around them collapsed in an instant. Experts examining the scene of the incident determined that Jody had sustained several serious injuries, including a gunshot wound to the head. Moreover, the criminal subjected her to brutal violence before leaving her to die among the trees near the road she was riding to the stable. The police reported that Jody never reached her destination. Her journey was interrupted at this tragic location. Detectives immediately began an investigation, trying to gather all possible evidence and understand who could have committed this heinous crime. Every piece of information was important, and they meticulously searched the area where Jody was found, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the evidence. Jody's father, despite his condition, tried to understand how this could have happened. He remembered the morning when his daughter left on a bicycle, smiling and full of life. The mother, in shock, could not comprehend that she would never see her daughter again. For the Loomis family, that day marked the beginning of endless pain and losses they would have to live with. The community was shocked by this tragedy. News and newspapers covered the event, causing a wave of sympathy and support for the Loomis family. People expressed their solidarity, helping the family cope with grief and supporting them in difficult times. This tragedy left a deep mark in the hearts of all who knew Jody. After questioning the area's residents, detectives were able to reconstruct an approximate chronology of the events of that day. Jody left home around noon and first stopped by her friend and neighbor to invite her to join the trip. However, the friend was busy and could not go with her. Jody did not linger and continued her way to the stable. At the end of their street, she passed a girl who was selling apples at her house. The girl waved to Jody, and she responded with a smile and a nod. After that, Jody disappeared without a trace. Around 5:30 in the evening, Jody was discovered in a wooded area next to the road. A man and woman passing by noticed something strange near a fallen tree. They stopped the car and approached to find out what it could be. Their hearts clenched when they saw barely alive Jody lying on the ground, bleeding profusely. She was almost without clothes, her body covered with numerous injuries. The driver immediately thought about driving to the nearest payphone to call an ambulance, but assessing the severity of her condition, decided that it would be better to try to take her to the hospital themselves. Every minute counted, and any delay could cost her life. He carefully lifted her and placed her in the back seat of his car, while his wife tried to keep Jody conscious by talking to her and preventing her from losing consciousness. They raced to the nearest hospital, trying not to lose a second. The entire trip took about 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Despite all efforts, Jody's injuries were too severe. Upon arrival at the hospital, doctors confirmed that the girl had died on the way. People who discovered Jody reported that she was only wearing boots and underwear. The rest of her clothes were scattered nearby. Experts who examined the found items did not discover any significant clues. Jody's bicycle was found approximately 50 meters from the place where she was discovered. It lay on its side, as if thrown in haste. Investigators also learned that Jody had taken a bridle for horses from her home, but despite thorough searches, it was never found. In addition to clothing, an empty cartridge was found at the crime scene. Despite hopes, this clue also failed to help the investigation. The cartridge contained no fingerprints or other signs that could lead to a suspect. This fact only complicated the investigation, leaving detectives without significant leads. Search groups were organized to re-examine the area where Jody was found, hoping to find at least some new clue. Several weeks had passed, and hopes for a quick resolution of the case were diminishing. However, the detectives did not give up. They continued to study every detail, every testimony, striving to piece together the entire puzzle. This case became not just a matter of duty for them, but a personal challenge that required their utmost dedication and diligence. This terrible story shocked everyone who knew Jody. Her relatives and friends could not believe that something like this could happen to such a kind and bright person. The police and detectives continued to work, hoping to find the culprit and achieve justice. The first thing investigators focused on was Jody's fiancé, Jim. However, he had a solid alibi. By a sinister coincidence, Jim worked at the very hospital where Jody was brought. His colleagues confirmed that he was on shift that day and had not left the building. Jim was devastated by this tragedy, and his grief only intensified the investigators' determination to find the guilty party. Next, the investigators decided to check the family who owned the wooded area where Jody was found. They questioned all family members, trying to find out if anyone had noticed anything suspicious. The family was shocked by the incident and cooperated actively with the investigation. With each passing day, the hopes of solving the case dwindled. All possible versions and suspicions were checked, but none yielded results. Soon, the investigators began analyzing past crimes in hopes of finding any parallels or common features that might lead them to the perpetrator. But this direction also yielded no results. The local police sought help from residents, distributing flyers and urging anyone who might have seen something unusual to report to the police. However, despite all efforts, no new leads emerged. Without any new evidence or witnesses, the case stalled. The investigators were forced to admit that they had exhausted all possibilities for continuing the investigation. Jody Loomis's case was filed away as unsolved. For the next 36 years, the investigation into Jody Loomis's murder remained at a standstill until it was handed over to the Cold Case Unit in 2008. A new team of detectives enthusiastically took on the case, hoping to find new leads and solve the long-standing crime. However, what first struck them was the absence of many key pieces of evidence, which had mysteriously disappeared from storage over the decades. Among the missing evidence were the bullet that killed Jody, her underwear, and biological samples taken from the victim's body. This seriously hindered the investigation, leaving the detectives without crucial evidence. It was assumed that other police officers had accidentally sent these pieces of evidence for analysis, confusing Jody's case with another similar murder. When that case was solved, the evidence was destroyed, not knowing that it could have been key to solving Jody's murder. As a result, the investigators were left with only a few items: Jody's shoes and some elements of her clothing. These items were meticulously studied in the laboratory. Experts thoroughly examined every inch of the remaining evidence, hoping to find anything that could lead to the perpetrator. On one of Jody's shoes, they noticed a small stain that had previously gone unnoticed. After careful analysis, experts determined that it was a drop of male semen. This discovery was an unexpected breakthrough in the case. While most other evidence had been lost, this small detail could be the key to unraveling the murder. Despite the fact that this tiny clue had been stored for a full 36 years, experts managed to extract a DNA profile of the presumed criminal. This was a significant breakthrough, considering how much time had passed since the crime. The experts immediately began analyzing the DNA, hoping that modern technology would allow them to identify the perpetrator. They used all available resources and databases to find a match. However, when they checked this profile against the FBI database, It turned out there were no matches. This meant that the perpetrator had not been in the sights of law enforcement over the decades and had not been prosecuted for serious crimes. The investigators did not stop there. They compared the DNA sample with profiles of all suspects, including Jody's fiancé Jim, who had already been checked and had an alibi. They also approached residents of the area where the murder occurred, interviewing many men who lived in that area at the time of the crime. They were asked to provide DNA samples for comparison with the found profile. People, shocked by this tragedy, willingly cooperated, hoping to help in the investigation and finally find the guilty party. However, despite all efforts, none of the conducted comparisons yielded a positive result. The investigators did not receive a single match, and this again led the case to a deadlock. The detectives were disappointed, but they did not give up. They understood that the perpetrator might be somewhere nearby, possibly even leading a normal life, remaining unnoticed. The only hope was that sooner or later the perpetrator would come into the police's view again, and his DNA would be entered into the database. Until then, the detectives had no choice but to wait and hope. Finally, the investigators decided to try an unconventional approach. The police participated in creating a unique deck of playing cards, each featuring information about various unsolved crimes that had occurred in the county. Jody Loomis' case was also included in this list, and her story was printed on one of the cards. The decks were distributed in local prisons in hopes that someone among the inmates might have heard about these cases from their cellmates. The idea was that murderers and criminals often boast about their exploits to other inmates, not greatly fearing that their cellmates will tell the police. However, inmates are often willing to trade such information for a reduction in their own sentences or improved conditions of detention. This was a kind of psychological trick aimed at extracting information from the most unexpected sources. The investigators eagerly awaited results. They hoped that at least one of the inmates would be aware of the details of Jody's case and agree to share information in exchange for a favorable offer. Months passed, but no new information came in. The inmates, it turned out, either knew nothing about the crime or were unwilling to share the information they had. Unfortunately, this step bore no fruit. The case again stalled, and the detectives were at an impasse. The investigation was resumed only in 2018, when advances in DNA analysis opened up new unique opportunities for the investigators. That year, an innovative technology known as genetic genealogy began to be actively used, allowing researchers to find relatives of a DNA owner, giving police a unique tool for searching for suspects. In July 2018, the detectives decided to use this technology and sent the DNA sample of Jody's killer to the private laboratory Paragon Nanolabs, known for its successes in genetic genealogy. The laboratory experts began searching for relatives of the criminal, analyzing genetic samples in databases. The success of this method depended on the presence of genetic information about the suspect's relatives in the databases. Even if there was only a distant relative in the database, it could be the key to solving the case. The work was labor-intensive and required time and effort. Eventually, they discovered a third cousin of the killer. This result was a significant breakthrough in the investigation. Detectives, together with an expert in genealogy, began the meticulous work of compiling the genealogy of the third cousin, trying to determine which of his relatives could be involved in the crime. They studied many family branches, filtering out unsuitable people by gender, age, and other signs. After exhaustive work, the detectives finally identified the parents of the suspected murderer. They lived just a half-hour's drive from the place where Jody Loomis's body was found. However, there was a serious problem. This couple had 6 sons. As they delved into the biographies of each of them, the detectives quickly singled out the main suspect. This man, Terrence Miller, lived just 8 kilometers from the murder site. His name had appeared in police reports multiple times. He had been charged with violent crimes, including against children, 5 times. Despite this, the courts had acquitted him each time, and Miller had never served a serious sentence. In 1972, when Jody was killed, he was 30 years old. Terrence Miller had lived in the same place all his life, and in 2018 continued to live there with his wife, to whom he had been married for 43 years. However, his family life was far from peaceful. Before this, he had been married 3 times, and each marriage ended in divorce. The first time he married at the age of 18, when his bride was just 14. They had 2 daughters, but the couple separated after a few years. With his next wife, Miller also had a daughter, but this marriage also did not last long. The third marriage resulted in the birth of 2 more daughters, but it also ended in divorce. Thus, Terrence Miller had 5 children from 3 different women. His unstable family life and past accusations of violence made him the main suspect in the case of Jody Loomis's murder. For most of his life, Terrence Miller worked as a heavy equipment operator. In retirement, he and his 4th wife started selling ceramic products, leading a quiet and unremarkable life. At first glance, this elderly man did not fit the role of a ruthless murderer. However, the detectives were almost certain of his guilt based on genetic data and his past. To gather incontrovertible evidence, the investigators decided to obtain a sample of his DNA. For this, they had to monitor Miller for several days, hoping to find an item on which he might have left his biological material. They knew this was the only way to confirm his involvement beyond a shadow of a doubt. Their chance came on August 28th. Miller went to a casino, and before entering, he discarded a paper coffee cup in a trash bin. The detectives who were watching him immediately retrieved the cup and sent it to the laboratory for analysis. Experts conducted a thorough examination and established that the DNA from this cup matched completely with the semen found on Jody's shoe. This conclusively confirmed Miller's guilt. The investigators realized that they had finally found the murderer and could seek justice for Jody and her family. They began preparing the case for trial, gathering all necessary evidence, including genetic data and records of Miller's past crimes, to present a compelling case to the jury. Over the following months, the investigators meticulously worked on the case, reviewing all the collected evidence and preparing for the trial. They understood how important it was to convey the truth and secure a fair verdict for Miller. Ultimately, in 2019, nearly half a century after the murder of Jody Loomis, Terrence Miller stood trial. The court set bail for the 77-year-old Terrence Miller at $1 million. To the surprise of many, on June 14th, Miller managed to post this substantial amount. He used a bail bond company, which posts bail for a non-refundable percentage, paying $100,000 to await trial at his home instead of in jail. After being released on bail, Miller was fitted with a tracking bracelet, and his movements were strictly limited. He was only allowed to leave his home for grocery shopping and doctor visits. For Jody Loomis's relatives, this was a blow. They were outraged by the fact that a person accused of a brutal murder had the opportunity to await trial in the comfort of his home, especially considering that he had remained free for 47 years after committing the crime. Despite their outrage and protests, the court's decision remained unchanged. Jody's relatives felt that the justice system had let them down again, allowing the suspect to live almost a normal life until the trial began. The situation was further complicated by Miller's lawyers requesting a postponement of the initial hearing, which was originally scheduled for the same year. These requests by the lawyers added fuel to the fire. Jody's relatives feared that delaying the trial would give Miller a chance to avoid punishment. They worried that every day of freedom gave him an opportunity for manipulation or attempts to evade justice. However, the judicial system was required to follow procedures, and the request for a postponement was granted. These events only strengthened the resolve of Jody's family to achieve justice. They continued to support the investigators and the prosecution, hoping that truth and justice would prevail. The initially scheduled hearing was postponed to the following year, under the pretext of lack of time for preparation due to the pandemic. By the end of 2020, Miller's lawyers again tried to delay the start of the trial, but their request was denied. The last attempt by the defense was a motion to exclude DNA analysis, based on doubts about its accuracy, but this too was unsuccessful. The trial finally began on October 26th. Miller pleaded not guilty and left the defense in the hands of his lawyers, refusing to testify personally. The countless postponements of the hearings negatively affected the case. The man who found Jody's body died a few months before the trial began, leaving behind video-recorded testimony. Miller's lawyers actively used this fact, trying to shift the blame onto him based on several discrepancies. Firstly, this man provided the police with several reasons why he and his partner were in the wooded area. Initially, he claimed that they planned to go shooting, but it later turned out that he was having an affair with this woman, hidden from his wife. Secondly, it was discovered that he had a .22 caliber weapon, matching the bullet used in Jody's murder. At the time of the trial, his lover was still alive but battling cancer. Despite this, she appeared at the hearing and told her version of the events. She claimed that they wanted to spend time in the woods but stumbled upon Jody and tried to help her before the ambulance arrived. She confidently denied any involvement in the murder. Miller's lawyers, seizing the opportunity, began to attack the DNA analysis results, questioning the professionalism of the experts who collected samples from Jody's shoe. During the trial, the defense emphasized that in the 1970s, forensic experts did not detect any stains on the shoes, which were taken as evidence. This circumstance was used to cast doubt on the methodology and accuracy of the early forensic examinations. They argued that at that time, there were no technologies or methods that could accurately detect traces that are now considered critical. On the other hand, the prosecution insisted that the DNA analysis results were conducted strictly according to all established norms and procedures. The presence of Miller's semen on the victim's shoes was recognized as incontrovertible evidence of his involvement in the crime. Miller consistently told his lawyers that he had never met Jody and had no personal relationship with her. This statement created difficulties for the defense, because if there were no personal connections, then how to explain the presence of his DNA on her shoes? The story with the shoes was particularly intriguing. It turned out that they belonged to Jody's younger sister, who had taken them without warning to get to the stables. This circumstance raised many questions among the court participants. Could it be possible that Miller's semen traces got on the shoes before the crime occurred? This hypothesis, although unusual, required careful consideration. Jody's younger sister, who was 12 years old at the time of her sister's murder, told the court that she had never seen the man who was now on trial. Her bright eyes were filled with sincerity when she added that she did not know his name or face until that day in court. These words from Jody's younger sister became a stumbling block for the defense, which tried to suggest a possible acquaintance between Miller and Jody. However, her testimony was so clear and convincing that any further discussion of this theory seemed pointless. Thus, the testimony of the younger sister became a key point that fundamentally rejected the defense's version of a possible connection between the accused and the victim. The prosecution's version in Jody's case shocked everyone present in the courtroom. According to their statements, Miller saw Jody on a remote road and, threatening her with a weapon, forced her to follow him into a dense forest. There, according to their version, brutal violence occurred, ending in murder. Shortly after, he fled the crime scene, and soon after his departure, the man and woman who found Jody arrived. Despite all efforts, Miller's lawyers were unable to shake the jury's confidence in the prosecution's version. However, Miller himself, according to his lawyers, no longer hoped for a victory. As the lawyers confessed, the prosecution presented a recording of a phone call Miller had with his wife, which was made at the stage of his arrest. In this conversation, he repeatedly spoke about expecting prison and that he could not avoid punishment. He pointed to the presence of his DNA in the case materials, stating that it was an indisputable fact. Throughout the conversation, he did not utter a word about his innocence, only repeating that he expected a long sentence behind bars. The court session, which began on October 26th, was concluded on Friday, November 6th. The jury was given several days to discuss and make a decision. The judge gave them the weekend to carefully weigh all the evidence and arguments presented during the process. On Monday, they gathered again, ready to make their final decision. At this time, an unexpected event occurred. Miller's wife called the police, reporting that her husband had committed suicide using a firearm. Under the terms of his release on bail, he was required to surrender all his weapons to the police, but he had secretly kept one pistol. Miller's fate became known only 3 hours after the jury made their decision. Miller's lawyers requested to postpone the announcement of the verdict, arguing that after the accused's death, it would be a pointless act. However, the judge insisted that the victim's family had the right to the final verdict. The jury was ready to express their opinion, and they found Miller guilty of murdering Jody. This news was particularly bitter for Jody's parents, who never saw the final act of justice. Her father died in 2005, and her mother passed away at the beginning of 2019. Jody's only younger sister expressed gratitude to the court, police, and experts who had worked tirelessly to solve the murder. She confessed that the family had lost hope for justice years ago, but finally, it had prevailed. Thus, the trial concluded, leaving behind numerous questions and sorrowful memories for all participants in this tragic story. Like this video if you enjoyed this investigation and subscribe to the channel to be the first to see new releases. Thank you for watching.